Hello and a very warm welcome to all of you. My name is Pratik and I'll be taking up the News Today discussion for 3rd March 2026. In the main news, the first news that we'll be discussing is the visit of Prime Minister of Canada. And here we'll talk about the various MOUs agreements that India and Canada have recently signed. The second news is with respect to the government assessment of the impact of the ongoing war in West Asia. So here we'll look into the multi-dimensional impact that this war will have on India's interest. In the third news, we'll talk about India concluded 9 FTAs covering 38 countries in last 3 years, boosting the exports. So here we'll talk about all these initiatives that have helped India in boosting exports, including the various schemes and policies that the government has launched recently. In the fourth news, we'll talk about a recent statement made by CJI Suryakant that arbitration framework has matured in India considerably, but challenges remain. So here we'll talk about the entire idea or concept of the arbitration process, the mechanism that is present in India, and what kind of challenges that we face in the arbitration process. In the places in news, we'll talk about the major straits in the Indian Ocean, and then we'll talk about certain quick updates. So let's talk about the very first news, that is the conclusion of the visit of Canadian PM to India. So we all know that Canadian PM Mark Carney was recently visiting India, and then a host of agreements have been signed. Now this topic will fall under GS Paper 2 International Relations, where bilateral relations engagement with different countries are to be studied. Okay, and here this is very significant because the India-Canada relations have been not in a very good state since 2022-2023, but now we see that the relations is now on a strategic reset, and this relationship is primarily resting on three major pillars. One is diaspora. So we have around 1.6 million Indians who are there in Canada from India. Then the second pillar of relationship is energy, where India requires uranium and Canada is a provider of uranium to India. And thirdly, there is also trade and investment, where the pension and the other foreign trade in direct investment is also done from Canada to India. Apart from that, Canada is also looking to reset its foreign policy because of the ongoing tension with US, and definitely India is also looking forward to diversifying its foreign policy, and there this relationship becomes a study where we understand and analyze how the middle powers reset their relationship in the changing geopolitical context. So in that relation, in that background, we need to understand what has been the major contours of the change, the announcement that has been recently held as part of the Canadian PM visit. So if you can look into the major outcomes. So largely, first one is with respect to trade and investment. So as part of this, we have signed a term of agreement to finalize a CEPA, that is Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement. Now the bilateral trade between India and Canada currently is around $8 to $9 billion, which is very less, and there is a huge potential to take it to as high as $50 billion to 2030. So this is what they have suggested, that we can do this. Second important pillar of announcement is with respect to energy security, where there has been a finalization of a long-term commercial contract with Canada's firm Cameco for the supply of uranium ore concentrates. Now this is going to be a significant development with respect to India's energy security, especially given the disturbance in the West Asian region, right? The third important pillar of the announcement is with respect to the cooperation in the critical minerals. Now we all know how important the critical minerals are, and these critical minerals are subjected to supply chain disruptions. That is why this agreement again assumes a lot of importance. So there has been MOUs to develop secure and resilient critical minerals supply and value chains, which are going to be very significant for developing India's sovereign AI and for the green energy transition. And then there's a declaration for a joint pulse protein center of excellence. And this is very important because India imports its pulse requirement from different countries, and Canada is again one of the major import source from where we get our pulses from. Now, this is going to have a significant impact on our energy security. Apart from this, there have been several announcements that has been made with respect to various goals. So one, we have already talked about that with respect to the trade, we want to achieve the bilateral trade by to $50 billion, which is currently at around $8 to $9 billion, and the time that is set is 2030. In fact, you may be also aware that we have also signed a significant agreement with US as well, where this is by the name of Mission 500, where we want to take our bilateral trade to $500 billion by the same period. Okay. Then Canada has announced to join significant international organization backed by India, or in fact, where India is the most important player, Global Biofuel Alliance and International Solar Alliance. So recently, US has taken itself out from these alliances, and now Canada has joined it. Then formation of an India-Canada Parliamentary Friendship Group. This will ensure that the parliamentary or institutional safeguards or mechanisms can be studied. In fact, you may be aware, in fact, you must be aware that India has borrowed most of its federal provisions from Canada. So some of these provisions can be studied and maybe more robust engagements can be done. Then establishment of India-Canada Defense Dialogue. Again, this is going to be a very important development because now we can see how the relationship is now diversifying from the pillar of energy and economic ties to defense dialogue as well. Right? So this is all about India-Canada relations. At the same time, we should understand that this relationship is not without its tensions, not without its challenges. So despite all the challenges, we need to ensure that this relationship is taken to its most seriousness, and all these announcements should be implemented as early as possible. The next news is with respect to the impact of war in West Asia on India. And this is important from the perspective of, again, GS paper 2 IR. And the context or the backdrop of this is that Government of India has in a way led inter-ministerial deliberations with exporters and logistics players to assess the kind of impact that the ongoing turmoil of West Asia will have on different sectors, right? So this war is now, which started on February 27, 28, between Israel and US versus Iran, has now assumed a regional dimension where countries like Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, all are involved directly or indirectly. In fact, some of the US air fleets have been shot by mistake by Qatar Air Force as well. So in a way, what we can see here is that this war is not going to be a very short prone war. It's going to be a very long drawn war because the US and Israeli defense forces, they critically underestimated the kind of resolve or the response of the of Iran, right? So this is going to have a far-reaching impact on geopolitically in terms of various other aspects, including energy security and trade, etc. And particularly, we'll need to understand how this particular tension will have ramification on India's interest. So starting with, the first important thing is that it is going to have a threat on our energy security. Why? Because now that Iran already has blocked the Strait of Hormuz, it is concerning because roughly 1/5 or 20% of the global oil passes from Strait of Hormuz, right? And Strait of Hormuz carries 85% of India's LPG and 55% of India's LNG. So this becomes very critical. Secondly, India relies on imports for more than 85% of its crude oil needs, with a substantial portion coming from West Asia. So earlier, India would offset this from its oil import from Russia, but as we know, because of the several issues and with respect to some of the ongoing pressure from US, India is in a way calibrating or decided to reduce its oil import from Russia. So this, again, this development becomes very critical for India's energy security. Secondly, it also impacts India's trade. Not only energy, but India's West Asia is also a very critical source of India's export basket, where 56% of India's global goods export are traded in West Asia. It raises concerns as the region serves as a major market for India and a transit corridor that takes it to Europe, Africa, etc. Apart from that, it also leads to supply chain disruption. Why? Because the shipping routes are, if you increase the whole routes, then the insurance cost and the logistic cost also increases. It affects Gulf transshipment hubs like in UAE and port of Salalah in Oman. So these are some of the other development. Apart from that, there is issues with respect to diaspora, the population of India that is residing in UAE and in other Gulf nations, right? So in terms of diaspora, Indians constitute around 30% of the total expatriate workers in the Gulf Cooperation Council, and more importantly, there are around 10 million Gulf Indians are there currently working. Then direct impact of the diaspora is with respect to the money that they send to India, which is called as remittances. So around one fifth or around 20% of India's total remittance come only from UAE and 7% from Saudi Arabia, while Kuwait, Oman, and Qatar also have a significant contribution according to an RBI report. Also, this ongoing issue is going to have a significant impact on the connectivity initiatives such as International North-South Transport and Transit Corridor and the recently announced IMEC, that is the India Middle East Europe Economic Corridor, and the Chabahar project port that India was operating in Iran, right? So these are some of the potential challenges. In fact, these are not the potential challenges. These challenges are already occurring in some way or the other. And if the war prolongs, these challenges are going to get more significantly impacting India's interest. Apart from that, we all know that the Sensex or the stock market is also responding negatively. And then there is capital outflight, there is pressure on the rupee. So all of them are some of the significant challenges that we are witnessing because of the ongoing war. If you look at the previous year question, UPSC has asked direct and indirect questions. One question that UPSC asked last year itself was with respect to energy security, how it constitutes a dominant kingpin of India's foreign policy and is linked with India's overarching influence in Middle Eastern countries. Then how would you integrate energy security with India's foreign policy trajectory in the coming years? So the question is that, yes, energy security is important, but should we not integrate it with other foreign policy consideration of India, right? So it can be in a way that India must also develop deep financial interlinkages with the countries of the West Asia with its own economy. For example, the India UAE defense relations, or India UAE or Saudi Arabia cooperation in different infrastructure projects or sovereign funds, etc. And then, so this is how questions can be framed. And secondly, questions can be framed with respect to in what ways would the ongoing US-Iran nuclear pact controversy affect the national interest of India. So even though this development does not directly impact India, we have seen how does any development in the West Asian region has direct impact on different dimensions of India's interest, right? So similar kind of response can also be written when questions come directly from the US-Israel/Iran conflict, right? Next topic is India concluded 9 FTAs covering 38 countries in the last 3 years, boosting exports. So this topic will be part of GS Paper 3 Economy. And recently we all know that India has concluded FTA with European Union, which is hailed as the mother of all trade deals, and then with UK as well, and then also with Oman and New Zealand. So in the past 3 years, India has signed FTA with these many countries, right? And this has led to significant increase in the exports, as much as that the cumulative export has reached around 720 billion in the first 10 months of this April to Jan financial year, with a growth of 6.1% year on year. And the FTAs has also given us access to zero duty market access to nearly 70% of the global GDP. So let us unpack this news. So what is the performance that India has felt, especially with respect to the export performance? So first, with respect to the electronics good, this has seen the most important or positive development, where there was a time when India would import some of the smartphones, right? Most of the smartphones. But now, because of several initiatives like production linked incentives, initiative like electronics component manufacturing scheme, etc., India has now appearing as the third largest export category and the second largest mobile phone manufacturer. Now, again, this has happened because of the favorable policy initiatives, because of the working or development in the infrastructure sector, right? Secondly, with respect to the petroleum products, you'll be surprised to know that India is also exporting. India is the seventh largest global exporter of the refined petroleum. So we do import the crude petroleum, but we have a very robust refineries. So we refine petrol and then we export it to different countries. And India is also known as the pharmacy of the world, because India is very robust when it comes to generic pharmacy. And India ranks third largest pharmaceutical producer by volume and 11th largest by value. Now, for this, APIs or the active ingredients which are required is something where India has done exceptionally well. India has sought a huge supply, where India is now working on it, and now India is looking at consolidating all its gain with respect to pharmaceutical as well. Then India has also launched several initiatives that has given it a lot of impetus. Then with respect to automobiles and textiles, the automobile sector provides direct and indirect employment to over 30 million people, while textile maintain the sixth largest global export share. So both of them are export intensive and labor intensive sectors, and India has done well to focus more on these two important sectors. Then with respect to defense, this is coming across as the new frontier of our export, where India is expanding to over 100 nations, achieved defense export of rupees 23,622 crores in FY25. So this is the sectoral performance of India's export. Particularly, we have done well in the electronic sector, in the pharmaceutical sectors, in the petroleum products, and automobiles, textiles, and defense. Now, what is the reasons why we have done so? The reason for the performance of our export sector can be attributed to a host of reasons. First reason is the institutional support that is provided by government. And for this, there is one mechanism called Export Promotion Mission, which is backed by a 25,060 crore outlay. And this mission especially empowers the MSMEs and the first-time exporters via Niryat Protsahan and Niryat Disha. So Niryat Protsahan is the financial incentive, and the Niryat Disha is the non-financial incentives or the innovations, right? So in a way, this is how the government is targeting not just the very large suppliers, but also MSMEs, because they also contribute very significantly when it comes to export and other things. Then logistics and warehousing initiatives like Flow and Lift. They have subsidized overseas warehousing and offset freight disadvantage in the low export area. So Flow, Lift, again, they are very important. And then there's a Trace initiative to reimburse the cost for international testing, inspection, and certification requirements, so that the other countries or the markets do not impose non-tariff barriers on our products. So a quality certification is provided within Trace, right? So these are some of the initiatives that is given for the MSME sector. Apart from that, there is PLI, production linked incentives, where the government provides incentive for extra production in terms of some tax rebate, in terms of certain other benefits. So this has become very important. Then there is Make in India. So Make in India essentially was about providing an overall ecosystem reforms in terms of increasing improving the logistics sectors, expanding the infrastructure, etc. Then the production linked incentive was sector driven. Initially, it was given to certain sectors, and then based on the performance, it was expanded to other sectors. So these are some of the initiatives such as PLI schemes. It was given in auto sector, automobile sector, in the bulk drugs. Again, this to ensure that India remains the pharmacy of the world, and medical devices. It is aimed at reducing the critical import dependence. Then we have also gone for tech and EV push through initiative like India Semiconductor 2.0, the 40,000 crore electronics component manufacturing scheme, and then the 10,900 crore PM e-drive scheme to accelerate domestic manufacturing and self-reliance. Now, this self-reliance is particularly very important for the critical sectors and for the export intensive and the labor intensive sectors like textile and automobile. Right? So from this topics, UPSC has asked a very direct question last year that was about the rationale for the production linked incentive. What are the achievement, in what way can the functioning and the outcomes of the scheme be improved? Again, UPSC has also asked a question on the electronics component manufacturing scheme as well, right? So ultimately, the whole idea is to provide incentive based on extra production, right? And then it is also to ensure that the ease of doing business is improved, the logistics costs are removed. So it essentially promotes the export-oriented sectors and thereby ensure that the critical supply is contained and the labor-intensive sectors are also given a boost, thereby providing employment and inclusive growth, right? So this is how UPSC can ask question on this. The next news is on a statement made by the Chief Justice of India, Surya Kant, that is, the arbitration framework has matured considerably, but challenges remain. And this is a topic that is there from GS paper 2 polity, where you need to understand the alternatives ways of of justice delivery, ADR, alternative dispute resolution method. So arbitration is one of the ways to address the disputes. So why this was in news? Because despite significant reforms, legislative reforms, legal reforms to strengthen the arbitration ecosystem, India continues to be considered or be less preferred destination for international arbitration. So let us understand the process of arbitration. So arbitration in general means that you are not going with the traditional judicial approach for resolving dispute. Suppose there are two commercial entities, company A and company B, and they have a dispute with respect to, say, patent or something. Now, the traditional route is that they can go to the High Court or Supreme Court to resolve their dispute, but that process may take so much time because we know that how much judicial pendency is there. That is one thing. Second is that there is no expertise that is there. So because the companies essentially will be working with a state-of-art technology and with various precision areas. And it is possible that many of the judges may not have that much depth of understanding in these areas. So again, the first thing is to avoid delay. Second is to provide expertise. And third is to ensure that their trade secrets do not go outside or they are not out in the public. It should be resolved in-house, right? That is why arbitration is done. So with arbitration, what happens is the two parties, they select their own arbiter. So it could be in-house arbitration or it could be external arbitration. Generally, the commercial arbitration are conducted in external arbitration, where the set of rules or the norms in which the arbitration process or the process of whole dispute resolution is undertaken through a particular set of rules. So it is a procedure in which a dispute is submitted by agreement of the parties and to one or more arbitrators who make a binding decisions on the dispute. The arbitration is a quasi-judicial process. So it's not a judicial process, but it is like a judicial process. That is why it is called as a quasi-judicial process. It is one of the mechanisms of the alternate dispute resolution. The other methods are mediation, conciliation, etc. So what are the ways through which, so we have discussed about the arbitration, the concept of arbitration. So how it is done in India, what is the mechanism that is followed in India? For this, we have Arbitration and Conciliation Act 1996, which governs the entire arbitration process in India. So within this, so it is based on a UN model code, that is UNCITRAL, United Nations Commission on International Trade Law. It is of 1985, and UNCITRAL Conciliation Rules 1980. The awards, so the verdict that is given by the Arbitration Council is not called judgment, but they are called awards, and these awards are final, binding, and globally enforceable. Then we have certain arbitration centers such as MCIA, that is Mumbai Center for International Arbitration, and Delhi International Arbitration Center to provide institutional support. In fact, we also have arbitration centers in Gujarat, that is Gift City. And in 2015, certain amendments were done in this. And these amendments were essentially to provide a 12-month completion timelines, because whatever the cases came here in these arbitration centers, they were taking a lot of time. That is why it was decided to give them a timeline of 12 months to complete the entire arbitration process. And it also minimized the court interference, right? So that they can provide their award in the least interruptive manner. Then in 2019, the creation of Arbitration Council of India happened. And then in 2021, it allowed for an unconditional stay of the enforcement of arbitral award in cases where the arbitration agreement, contracts, or award itself was obtained through fraud or corruption. So 2021 essentially was to improve the quality of the arbitration process, where the process where if one of the awardees or contract was tainted through fraud or corruption, could be minimized, right? So these were the developments or the mechanism through how through these procedure, through where the arbitrary proceedings are conducted in India. Now, what are the challenges that we have faced? First is with respect to overburdened judiciary. Because of the overburdened judiciary, arbitration process has also not taken up in a full-fledged way. Secondly, the court is also intervening excessively in these matters, citing certain reasons, such as maybe they're not following the principles of natural justice or things like that. So they are excessively interfering here. And then the most important issue is with respect to enforcement. So the complex procedures and protracted court battles have hindered the reliable enforcement, because the parties are very much assured that if they appeal it to the highest court, their appeal will be entertained. That is why enforcement is problematic. Now, what are the recommendations for strengthening the arbitration regime? First is that we need to modernize laws. So already our arbitration law is based on UNCITRAL laws. At the same time, we should also look into the models practiced by Singapore, by Hong Kong, to understand what kind of laws are they practicing, and perhaps we also need to modernize our domestic legal framework with that of the international framework as well. Secondly, we need to limit the judicial intervention. We already know that judiciary is overburdened as per the data provided by National Judicial Data Grid. So definitely the judiciary should not intervene in such matters in a very arbitrary way, because they already are overburdened first. And secondly, these matters are highly technical in nature, where they may not have that much expertise. Third, technology should be leveraged, such as e-filing and video conferencing. Most of the times, the parties need not present in person to attend such arbitration proceedings. So perhaps we can use this video conferencing, we can use e-filing. Also, we may use also artificial intelligence as well. And more importantly, we should also boost public awareness through ICT campaigns, so that the acceptability of arbitration process should be encouraged in India or popularized in India. Now, from this topic, UPSC in 2015 asked a question that what are the major changes brought in the Arbitration and the Conciliation Act 1996 through the recent ordinance promulgated by the President? How far will it improve India's dispute resolution mechanism? Discussed. So we have already discussed some of the changes, such as bringing the resolution within 12 months and minimizing the interference of courts, etc. Apart from that, we can also mention here in terms of how far will it improve. So within this, we can mention that it will be dependent on the implementation process and also about the acceptability of the awards by the parties, right? So this thing we can attempt through what we have covered. Now, in the places in news, we'll discuss major straits in Indian Ocean. So recently, Iran has vowed to attack any ship that is trying to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. In fact, it has already hit several passenger ships, right, as the war is intensifying. So we must understand the importance of some of the important straits, and particularly Strait of Hormuz. Okay, so what is strait? Strait is a narrow passage of water like this, which is connecting two large river bodies. Okay, so strait is different from isthmus. Isthmus is a land border, or piece of land that is connecting two other bodies, and strait is a water body that is connecting two larger ocean bodies or large seas or oceans, right? So there are a couple of major. So these straits are very important because through these straits, major trade supply happens, energy supply happens, cross, all these things happen, right? So they can also become an important choke points during war. And this is precisely what has happened in the recently held or the ongoing West Asian crisis. So what is Strait of Hormuz? This is Strait of Hormuz. It is connecting Persian Gulf with Gulf of Oman, these two. Then you have Bab el-Mandab. So Bab el-Mandab is the strait that is connecting this. This is the Red Sea with the Gulf of Aden. Okay, Gulf of Aden with Red Sea, that is Bab el-Mandab. Then there is Malacca Strait, very important strait that is connecting the Andaman Sea with the South China Sea. Again, there are several states as well, but these three are something that you must go and look into. In fact, I would also suggest you to look into all the neighboring countries of Iran, right? So which countries, Iran, for example, Iran has border with Turkey, with Central Asia also, Turkmenistan. This is Afghanistan, this is Pakistan. So these countries are sharing border with Iran. So this becomes highly important from the perspective of prelims. Then let's discuss the quick updates. So the first topic is hydrological hysteresis and landscape memory. So a very fascinating article came in today's The Hindu, and this talked about the concept of landscape memory, right? So largely our understanding of urban flood is that it is governed by the volume of water that is drained in that particular area. But the writer of this particular article suggests that it is also governed by the memory of the place or the landscape. For example, the landscape do not absorb the rain instantly or dry up immediately. So it is dependent on its memory of the past precipitation, right? And dictating the current soil saturation level. So this is the landscape memory part, and the landscape memory part essentially impacts the hydrological hysteresis. In fact, this is the behavior that we see. So it describes how a landscape response to rainfall depends on the current volume of rainfall along with the past events. Okay, so what it suggests is that when we are concretizing our urban areas, or we are using this to construct certain urban infrastructure, the landforms are forgetting how it used to store water earlier, and that is why they are not able to do this effectively. That is what they have said in this article, and it is especially relevant in terms of urban flooding to understand the context of urban flooding. So the traditional understanding is the prolonged water logging is essentially a function of the failure of the drainage system, which is correct to a large extent, but at the same time, it is also because of hysteresis. Previously saturated landscapes cannot absorb new rainfall, leaving surface water trapped on city streets. So from exam perspective, this can give you a different dimension of writing about urban flooding. Next news is with respect to current account deficit. And the news here is that our current account deficit number has slightly moderated, which means that it has reduced from the previous year. That is that it is now $30.1 billion in the period of April to December 2025 from $36.6 billion. This means two things: either our export has increased or whether our import has reduced, right? Now, what is the whole idea of CAD? CAD is a situation where we are comparing the country's total imports of goods, services, and transfer exceeding its total exports and transfers out, right? So this, the net difference is current account deficit. It encompasses not just goods and services, but also the income received from the investments abroad and unilateral transfers such as remittances and even foreign trade. So kind of question that could come in prelims is, what is the composition of CAD? So we have looked into the composition of CAD, which incident will lead to strengthening of CAD. So anytime we are importing more than exporting, then our CAD will also increase. If we are exporting more, then our CAD will reduce, right? Then this is about CAD. So again, this is how UPSC can ask you questions on CAD. Third topic is India-Japan bilateral currency swap agreement. So this will come to effect from 28th February 2026. So essentially what it means is that during the time of crisis, if India has shortages of US dollar, it can get it from Japan or vice versa, and India can get certain rupees to Japan, and Japan will provide India with US dollar for a temporary period, and then India will get it back. India will give back the dollar and get the rupee, and vice versa. So this is one of the important ways through which countries tend to ensure that the whole financial structure is robust. And this is not the first time that India has done any such agreement with a country. In fact, India has also done currency swap agreements with SAARC, UAE, Sri Lanka, etc. So this is broadly a broader term defined as agreement between two central banks to exchange a cash flow in one currency. So for example, Japanese yen, if Japan doesn't have too much dollar, it can get dollar from India, while Japan will provide yen to India, and then it will get it back after some time in another country according to predetermined condition, right? Next, nucleic acid test, NAT. So Supreme Court is looking into the perspective that whether blood banks should compulsorily conduct the nucleic acid test for identification of diseases. This is especially with respect to blood transfusion. You may know that during certain diseases like thalassemia, or during accident or during surgery, blood transfer is required. Now, blood transfusion is a very good initiative, like it is very helpful in saving life. But what if the person you are taking blood from has certain diseases, right? Like maybe HIV or the other disease like hepatitis, right? So to ensure that this event does not happen, the Supreme Court has suggested that perhaps we need to conduct a nucleic acid test. Now, even now, there's another test that is being conducted that is known as ELISA, right? ELISA test is done, that is enzyme-linked immunosorbent assay test. Now, ELISA test is fast, not fast enough, and it doesn't, it is even though it is somewhat cheaper compared to the NAT, but still it takes a lot of time to provide the whole disease list. But NAT is something that will give you instant result, but it is slightly expensive in nature. That is why Supreme Court has asked whether NAT can be a feasible solution for the states to decide for identification of disease for the blood banks. Next is sigma cycle. This is slightly complex. So sigma cycle, to understand this, we need to understand how bacteria or how the various functions or gene encryption of bacteria happens, right? So in bacteria, genes are not activated on the way go. Like it gets activated only when certain conditions for that activation is required. And for this activation to happen, the DNA gets copied into RNA, which is called as transcription. And for that transcription to happen, there's an enzyme that is required that is called RNA polymerase. So RNA polymerase is very important for the transcription process. But the transcription process to happen, the RNA doesn't know from where to start, and that this is where the sigma cycle comes into picture, because sigma is the enzyme that understands, or it works as a guide to tell that, okay, this is the sequence that you should be starting, right? So this leads to a process called a sigma cycle. Now, this study was done through a specific bacteria called E. coli, but after study of several other bacteria, there has been reports that this study is very limiting, and in some other bacteria, the evolution of the genetic cycle, it doesn't work in the sigma cycle fashion. So again, a lot of study is required, and this study is going to help us understand the evolution of bacteria, and thereby it will also help us develop a very effective antibacterial vaccines or drugs. Then next news is with respect to IAEA. So IAEA has, that is International Atomic Energy Agency, it has held an emergency meeting in Vienna to address the fallout of US-Israel military strikes, especially in the Iranian region, because most of the times when war breaks out, and especially if one of the receivers or one of the parties of the war is a nuclear-powered nation, or is supposed to be a nuclear-powered nation, it is possible that there could be some sort of emission of the radiation, contamination, etc. Now, to discuss that, there's a specialized body called IAEA that monitors the situation and takes action in case of any such radiation leaks, etc. So the body IAEA was formed in 1957 in the heights of the Cold War rivalry between US and USSR. It is the world's central intergovernmental forum for scientific and international technical cooperation in the nuclear field, particularly for the peaceful use of nuclear energy. And the headquarters is based in Vienna, Austria. It also received Nobel Peace Prize in 2005. Next news is with respect to Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, where the Union Finance Minister met the president of AIIB to discuss the strengthening of India-AIIB partnership. From exam perspective, we need to understand the nature of AIIB. So it was established in 2016. Objective is multilateral development banks that provides financing for infrastructure projects in Asia. Now, this was seen as one of the rivals of the World Bank or the Asian Development Banks, right? It is centered in Beijing, China, and it is different from NDB, the New Development Bank, that is based, again, it is based in Beijing only, but it is largely a BRICS bank. The membership is, it is open to all the members of the World Bank or Asian Development Bank, and India is one of the founding members of AIIB. The last news is with respect to total lunar eclipse and blood moon. Now, today India is in fact witnessing a total lunar eclipse as confirmed by the International Meteorological Department. So here we need to understand the concept of eclipse, the different types of eclipse. You have solar eclipse, you have lunar eclipse. What is the difference between them? And what is the concept of blood moon? So solar eclipse is when the earth or the moon comes between sun and earth, and lunar eclipse is when the earth comes between sun and moon, right? So it occurs when the moon passes entirely through the earth's umbra, that is the darkest part of its shadow, with this earth, sun and moon perfectly aligned, completely blocking direct sunlight. So in a way, the earth's shadow falls on moon, right? And in a way, it is said that moon is completely blocked. So this is called the eclipsing of moon. The same when happens with respect to earth through sun, through moon, then it is called as solar eclipse. Now, solar eclipse is considered to be very dangerous to be viewed through naked eyes, but largely the lunar eclipse is considered to be safer, right? Now, what is blood moon? So it is generally expected that because of the lunar eclipse, the moon will not be visible because the entire shadow of earth has fallen into the moon surface. But it some of these there's a phenomena called dispersion or atmospheric radiation that happens, right? So it doesn't allow the entire spectrum of the radiation to behave in the same way. The scattering of particles or the wavelength happens in a different way. So the Earth's atmosphere, it scatters the red wavelength. Red light has the highest wavelength, so its scattering is the most, right, or it is most concentrated, and the blue wavelength is something which has the lowest wavelength, so it is something that is blocked from reaching the lunar surface. So in this way, because of the Rayleigh effect, so this is called as Rayleigh effect, and because of that, the fact that there is a refraction by the Earth's atmosphere, only the red component of the electromagnetic spectrum is allowed to reach to the moon surface. Therefore, the moon appears to be red or copper like, and this is why it is called as blood moon, right? So this is the whole idea of total lunar eclipse and blood moon. So this is all about today's news today. I hope this was good for you. Thank you and all the best.